The ogallala aquifer, as depicted here, is a lifeline of the breadbasket area of the United States Great Plains, particularly the western plains, as depicted. The aquifer is the largest aquifer in the United States, lying in part a total of 8 states, as seen here: Texas, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska, Wyoming, and South Dakota. Currently, in the western high plains region, the aquifer is being used for irrigation at a unsustainable pace. First, we'll take a look at the history of the region itself. The first peoples to explore the western high plains were the Spanish, with Francisco Vasquez de Coronado, and what he found was an American desert. He had actually recommended that it was possibly good for farming and agriculture, but there was no gold there, and so the Spanish left uninterested. Later on, many years later, the Americans would acquire the western high plains. And to help settle the region, they passed the Homestead Act of 1862. And what that did was provide settlers with 160 acres of land for the price of a filing fee, as long as they lived on the land for 5 years, improved it, built a house on it, and farmed it. Many gung-ho Americans heeded this call to populate the West and set out to be farmers, even though many of them were inexperienced at that, to say the least. With the arrival of World War I, the price for wheat skyrocketed, and many farmers dug up as much of the native grassland as they could to plant their crops to make a profit. This went on until the 1930s or so, when the United States began to enter the Great Depression. To counteract the falling prices of crops such as wheat, farmers dug up as much native grassland as they could and farmed it, even if it wasn't very good farmland to begin with. All this plowing of the land eradicated the native grasslands and their long root systems, which held the soil in place. And what that did was, with the following years of drought, it made the soil very loose, and in high winds, it blew away, and there we have the Dust Bowl. Some people say that if the high plains in the Midwest had known about the Ogallala Aquifer, the Dust Bowl could have been averted. The thing is, many Midwesterners at this time knew there was water beneath their feet. The problem was they had windmills to pump the water out, which can only get so much water out of the ground. Therefore, there's no way to pump water unsustainably when you're just using wind energy to get it out of the ground. Now, motorized pumps appeared on in the high plains as early as 1911, but they didn't really become widespread until post-World War II, and that's really the modern era of the high plains region's excessive pumping of the aquifer that we see today. An example of this is that in the start of the 1940s in Oklahoma, less than 5,000 acres were irrigated, and by the 1950s, nearly 50,000 acres were being irrigated and growing, all due to the aquifer. Today, nearly 200,000 wells are being pumped, have straws into the aquifer, and in some places, the Ogallala has dropped nearly 200 feet. This unsustainable rate of pumping water out of the ground is unsustainable because the Ogallala aquifer is an unconfined aquifer and receives most of its resupply from rainfall and snowmelt, averaging to about an inch every year. And in fact, a Kansas State University study found that once depleted, the aquifer would take an average of 500 to 1,300 years to refill. And that same study found that if withdrawal rates continued as they are today, in 50 years, 69% of the aquifer's water would be gone. So this is a pressing issue within possibly our very own lifetimes. This is a problem because the aquifer is responsible for 30% of irrigated crops in the United States. And a report published by the Cornhusker Economics states that in 2007, the Ogallala aquifer was worth about $3.5 billion in agricultural production, and $2 billion of those dollars were in Nebraska alone, which is above the majority of the aquifer. And although the aquifer is used for residential uses, 94% of the groundwater used in the High Plains region is for irrigation alone. To give you an example of this, in Nebraska, 46% of their irrigation comes from Ogallala groundwater, Texas 30%, and Kansas 14%. To put this even better in perspective, in 2007 there were 50 million acres of cropland across the United States, and 15.4 million of those acres were irrigated in the High Plains region. And to continue that trend, the High Plains region currently produces more than 15% of the value of American wheat, corn, sorghum, and cotton, and 38% of the value of livestock. One of the main problems of the Ogallala Aquifer region and its unsustainable pumping is that there's not an overarching law among the 8 states that the aquifer is beneath to regulate pumping. Each state kind of does its own thing, and some states enforce their laws more so than others. In my opinion, this creates an environment to where farmers will think, why should I not excessively pump the groundwater from the aquifer and make as much money as I can while it's here, especially if, even if I convert to dryland farming, which is just using the natural rainfall, my neighbor's going to pump the aquifer dry anyway, so I might as well get my piece of the cake while it's good. The future, of course, with the pumping as it is, will eventually leave the aquifer dry. That could spell disaster, economic disaster for the High Plains region, which is highly dependent on its agriculture, but it could possibly help return some of the grasslands back to their native state, which could be a good thing, and to the right minds may even have opportunities for tourism or an ecotourism that didn't exist when it was nothing but farmland. Conservation, though, it can also help sustain the region's agriculture for a longer time. Technological efforts such as drip irrigation, flow meters on sprinklers, and soil moisture probes that determine the exact amount of water needed could help slow the depletion of the aquifer. Along with that, genetic engineering of plants could actually be helpful. Research led by the University of Illinois discovered a specific protein in plants called photosystem 2, subunit S, which can be increased in a plant to force a plant to partially close its stomata. And what that does, it decreases the amount of water lost to transpiration by 25%, and because of that, it decreases the amount of water needed to grow the plant by 25%. And the cool thing about this is the research and the researchers believe that because there's more carbon in the atmosphere today because of global warming and carbon emissions, the plant will need less carbon to grow sufficiently. Therefore, it didn't need its stomata as open as previous years. Then, of course, prolonging the sustainment of the aquifer can only last so long if we're still going to pump it to an unsustainable level. So the farmers would eventually be forced to convert to dryland farming. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Some have already done so. It just depends on how badly they want to stay in the region and how much of a living or how good of a living they're able to do for themselves. But the one thing that is certain about the future is it will bring change. The High Plains region looked very different when the Spanish arrived several hundred years ago, and it'll be sure to look somewhat different in the next 200 years. The American desert will most likely remain so, but the inhabitants and what's grown there and what kind of animals live there um, may be sure to change.